I always thought we had a good marriage. Not perfect, but steady. I came home from work, Elena made dinner, and we'd talk about our day. It was routine, but it felt right. So when she told me she needed space, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was stress from work. She'd been complaining a lot about her job, about her demanding boss and colleagues. I tried to be supportive, to listen, but then things started to shift. Little by little, she became more distant. The first time I noticed it, she came home late from work, nothing out of the ordinary, or so I thought. But when she walked through the door, she didn't have that warmth about her. It was like something was weighing on her, but she wasn't saying what. I asked how her day went, and she just shrugged. Busy, she said, no smile, no real engagement. That night, she didn't kiss me when she passed me in the kitchen. Just walked straight to the bedroom. I told myself, she's just tired. She'll snap out of it. But it didn't change. Days passed, and it only got worse. Elena was less affectionate, more absorbed in her phone, more distant in general. I tried asking her about it. She'd say I was being paranoid, that she was just recharging. But I could feel it. The gap between us was growing, and I started withdrawing too. Then, one evening, she left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went to shower. Her screen was cracked, something she'd complained about for weeks, but I didn't think anything of it until a notification popped up. A message from someone named Victor. I don't know why, but I picked up the phone and read it. Victor had sent her a text saying he missed her and couldn't wait to see her that night. My heart dropped. Who was Victor? I didn't recognize the name, and I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my chest. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was nothing, but my gut said otherwise. I didn't confront her right then. I couldn't. I wanted to be sure, to have more evidence before I did anything. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something had changed, and Elena wasn't telling me. She didn't suspect a thing. She went about her life like everything was normal. Meanwhile, I was quietly spiraling, feeling like I was standing on the edge of something big, and she had no idea I was watching, no idea I knew about Victor. I didn't say anything. Not yet. But I was already starting to make plans. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about Victor. I'd replay the message over and over in my head, trying to figure out who he was, how long this had been going on. Elena hadn't acted any differently around me, but I could feel the tension between us, like an invisible wall I couldn't break through. I stopped asking her about her day, stopped making small talk. It was like I was waiting for something, but I wasn't sure what. Elena, on the other hand, seemed more frantic to make things right. She started making more of an effort to get my attention, like she was trying to revive something that had long since died. But her attempts felt fake, almost like she knew, deep down, I'd caught on to something. She'd try to touch my arm, give me a hug when I came home, but it felt forced, like she was trying to make up for something I couldn't see. And it didn't make me feel better. It made me feel worse. The conversations we had were always short. She'd ask if I wanted to go out for dinner or do something fun, but I'd just nod or give a one-word answer. She'd get frustrated, but I could tell she didn't know why I was being so cold. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was just indifferent. I didn't care to play the game anymore. Her behavior started to change too. She'd spend more time on her phone, locking it when I came near, or disappearing into another room to make private calls. I was done asking about it. If she wanted to hide something, fine. But I wasn't going to beg her for the truth. I remember one evening, she came home late again, this time after a girls' night out she hadn't mentioned. I didn't ask about it. I just watched her as she walked in, not even bothering to look up at me. She acted like everything was fine, like I was the one who was acting strange. But then I started doing something I hadn't planned on. I began to subtly isolate her. I didn't want to make it obvious, but I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done. I talked to her coworkers, casually mentioning how off she'd been acting lately. I made sure they knew she'd been distant, distracted, and not herself. At first, they didn't think much of it. But little by little, they started giving her the cold shoulder. They stopped inviting her to lunch, stopped asking if she was going out after work. It was like they sensed the distance, too. I reached out to her family next. Nothing too direct. Just some casual conversations about how Elena was doing, how I was concerned she seemed a little lost lately, how she was getting more distant. They asked if I was okay, if there was something going on between us. I shrugged it off, but I could see in their eyes they were starting to question her too. It wasn't immediate. It didn't happen overnight. But slowly, her world started to shrink. Her friends, her co-workers, even her family, they all started to pull away. It was subtle at first, but after a while, Elena had no one. I watched it happen, and I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. She could feel it. She could feel the coldness, the isolation, and it was driving her crazy. But she still didn't know. She didn't know why. A few weeks went by, and Elena was unraveling. I could see it in her eyes, the confusion, the desperation. She didn't know it yet, but I was already prepared to show her the truth. One evening, I invited her to dinner. Nothing fancy, just a quiet meal at a small bistro. I made sure to downplay it, acting like everything was fine, like maybe this could be a chance to reconnect. She smiled, relieved, and suggested we go to our usual spot. But I told her I had it covered. At the restaurant, she kept trying to talk to me, asking about work, how I was feeling, even cracking a joke here and there. But I wasn't in the mood to pretend. My answers were short, distant. Fine. Good. She could feel it. The silence between us. The coldness. It seemed to push her harder, like she was trying to claw her way back into my attention. When the food came, I slid an envelope across the table. She didn't notice at first, too busy with her plate. But when she finally saw it, she paused. The smile dropped. She picked it up slowly, her fingers hesitant, like she already knew what it meant. She opened the envelope, and I watched her face change as she flipped through the photos. There they were, her and Victor, laughing, hugging, and even kissing in a park. I'd seen it all, watched it all, and now I was showing her. There was no anger, no shouting, just the quiet devastation of knowing she was caught. Her face drained of color. She couldn't even look at me. The pictures shook in her hands as she glanced up, hoping I'd say something, anything. But I didn't. I just stared at her, calm and steady. Finally, I asked, "Were you going to tell me?" I said it like it was no big deal, like I was asking about the weather. She stammered, her voice cracking, but I didn't let her explain. I didn't want her excuses. "I've been watching." "I knew," I said simply. She didn't respond. She couldn't. She just sat there, looking at the pictures, her face a mask of guilt and shock. I didn't say another word. I let her stew in the silence, the weight of what she'd done hanging in the air between us. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. She barely touched her food, and I didn't either. There was no point. We were two strangers sitting across from each other, both knowing what was lost. I paid the bill, and we left without a word. When we got home, I didn't want to argue, didn't want to scream or yell. I wanted something more. Something that would haunt her. I set Victor's phone down on the coffee table. I didn't say a thing. Just let her wonder how it had ended up there. The days after that dinner were quiet. Too quiet. Elena barely spoke to me. I didn't speak to her either. There was no need to. She already knew. She'd known before I even showed her the photos, but I guess it was easier to deny it than face the truth. Now she couldn't deny it anymore. I watched her struggle. At first, she tried to engage, ask me questions about how I was feeling, if I was okay, but I gave her nothing. Just blank responses. The more she pushed, the harder I pulled away. It wasn't even about hurting her anymore. It was about making her feel the emptiness she'd created between us. She wanted me to open up, but I just stared at her, emotionless. I wasn't going to make it easy for her. She started asking more direct questions. "Why are you acting like this? Why are you so cold?" I just shrugged. What was there to say? She knew why I was distant. She knew what she had done. Then it got worse. She started coming home later and later. I'm not sure where she was going, but she wasn't coming back with the same smile she used to have. There was nothing left to hide, and it showed in the way she held herself. She looked drained, like the weight of it all was starting to crush her. I didn't make any effort to stop it. Instead, I started pulling the strings tighter. One evening, I called her boss, pretending to be concerned about her well-being. I casually mentioned how she'd been acting a little off lately, not herself. I told him I was worried and didn't know how to help. The next day at work, Elena noticed her colleagues started treating her differently. Distant, cold. No one asked her out for drinks after work. No one included her in lunch plans. It wasn't like they were outright rude, but the subtle shift was there. They'd heard the same rumors I planted in the air, and they didn't want to get involved. Her friends, too, began pulling away. It started with small things, sorry, I'm too busy this week, or let's do lunch another time. I could see the confusion in her eyes when they started avoiding her calls. I didn't have to say a word. She was isolated now, her world shrinking, and I was just standing by, letting it happen. The worst part for her, I think, was when I started contacting her family. I didn't accuse her of anything, but I expressed concern about how she'd been acting. I mentioned that she seemed more stressed lately and wasn't herself. I didn't lie, not exactly. I just let the idea that something was wrong take root in their minds. They started to ask her questions, too. They stopped calling as often. And through all of this, Elena never once confronted me about the phone I'd left on the coffee table. It was always there, just sitting in the middle of the living room, a constant reminder that I was watching, that I knew. Every day, she would glance at it like it was a bomb, waiting to go off. But she never touched it. Maybe she was afraid. Or maybe she knew that the moment she acknowledged it, everything would finally collapse. I didn't need to confront her again. She was already unraveling on her own. The betrayal wasn't just in the affair anymore. It was in the isolation, the quiet distance I'd created between us. And she could feel it. It didn't take long before Elena's world started to fall apart. The isolation wasn't just from her friends and family, it was from me too. I didn't just shut her out emotionally. I made sure she couldn't find refuge anywhere. She tried, of course. She reached out, hoping to fix things, but it was like talking to a wall. I wouldn't meet her halfway. She started asking questions again. Why are you doing this? What do you want from me? But her voice had changed. It wasn't angry anymore. It was softer, quieter, like she was starting to understand that whatever had happened between us couldn't be fixed with a few words. She was desperate, but I wasn't the man she thought she knew anymore. The man who had loved her was gone. All that was left was someone who knew too much, someone who had watched her betray me and wasn't ready to let her off the hook. She tried harder to get my attention. She came home earlier, left me little notes around the house. Things like, I miss you and let's talk tonight. But I never touched them. I wouldn't even look at them. It was like I couldn't anymore. The worst part was the nights. She'd lie next to me in bed, trying to get comfortable, and I could hear her soft breaths in the dark. But I couldn't touch her. I didn't feel anything anymore. The love I'd had for her had been replaced with a kind of emptiness. I didn't want to fight or yell. I just didn't care. One night, she slipped out the door, dressed up, telling me she was meeting a colleague for drinks. I didn't ask any questions. I knew exactly where she was going and why she was wearing that dress. But I didn't stop her. I didn't say a word. I stayed behind and waited. Hours passed, and she didn't come back until late. But by then, I didn't need to confront her. I knew. I didn't need to make accusations. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done with that. Instead, I just watched her unravel, little by little. She was starting to feel it, the isolation, the distance, and the quiet guilt she was carrying. When she came back, she looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept at all. She didn't say a word, but I could see it in her eyes. She was waiting for me to react. But I didn't. I just kept walking past her, like she wasn't even there. She still didn't understand what was happening. She thought I was punishing her for the affair, but I wasn't. I was punishing her for thinking she could get away with it, for thinking she could betray me and walk away without consequence. The silence between us was louder than anything I could have said. She had no idea how much worse it was going to get. She still didn't know how much control I had over everything. The tension between us grew unbearable. Elena kept trying, but she couldn't figure out what was happening. She sent texts, suggested dinner dates, asked if we could talk. But I never responded. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was just done. Done with pretending, done with playing along. One evening, I came home late, and there she was, sitting at the kitchen table with a half-empty glass of wine. She looked at me, almost relieved to see me, like maybe this was the moment things would turn around. "Alexei," she said, voice soft, "we need to talk." I didn't sit down. I didn't move. "About what?" I asked, my tone flat. She took a deep breath, eyes flicking to the wineglass before meeting mine. "About us. About what's happening. We can't just keep ignoring this. We need to fix it." I felt a hollow ache in my chest, but it wasn't pity. It was exhaustion. Her words had become so hollow to me. We need to fix it? We couldn't fix something that had been broken for so long. "I'm not ignoring anything," I said calmly. "You're the one who's been keeping secrets." Her face faltered for just a moment, but she quickly put up her defenses. She opened her mouth, but I stopped her. "I know everything," I said quietly. Her eyes widened. She knew what I meant. "Victor, right?" I asked, almost whispering. For a second, I thought she might break down. But she didn't. She just nodded, looking away from me, unable to face the truth anymore. "I never wanted this," she said in a soft voice, almost like a plea. "I know," I replied, not unkindly. "But you still did it. And now, here we are." There was a long silence, the kind that felt heavier than any argument. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain herself. She had no more excuses, no more lies. Everything had been laid bare. "I'm sorry, Alexei," she said after a long pause, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I never wanted this." But I didn't need to hear her apologies anymore. They didn't change anything. I had already taken everything from her. The trust, the love, the future we had. And nothing she could say would bring it back. "I know you're sorry," I said, my voice flat. "But sorry doesn't change anything. Not anymore." Her eyes filled with tears, but there was no anger in me now. Just resignation. She had no more words, no more explanations. I wasn't going to argue, or yell, or demand an apology. It was over. And she knew it. I didn't stay to comfort her. I didn't stay at all. I walked away, leaving her there, sitting in that silence. The silence she had created. She didn't understand the depth of what I was doing, but it didn't matter. The truth was clear now. It was too late for anything to change. And I was finally at peace with it. Days passed, and Elena's world kept getting smaller. The more she tried to fix things, the worse it got. I didn't need to say anything anymore. She could feel it. The isolation I had carefully built around her was suffocating. At first, she tried to fight it. She'd reach out to me, to her friends, to her family. But one by one, they started slipping through her fingers. Her friends didn't call anymore. She'd reach out to them, make plans. But the responses grew colder, more distant. "Sorry, I'm busy. Maybe next time." It wasn't just that they didn't want to talk to her. They were starting to avoid her. They'd heard the rumors. They'd picked up on the change in her. It wasn't long before her family followed suit. I'd planted just enough doubt in their minds to make them question her. The casual mentions of how she seemed off lately had taken root. At first, they'd been concerned, but then the calls got shorter. They stopped asking if we were okay. Her mother would send her a text, asking if she was all right, but there was always that underlying tone of suspicion now. The cracks were visible, and no one was willing to repair them. But what hurt the most was the way I treated her. I'd stopped even pretending to care. I didn't yell, I didn't fight. I just didn't respond. When she'd ask if we could talk, I'd give one-word answers or just walk away. At home, I wasn't there. I wasn't part of her world anymore. I wasn't her partner. I wasn't even a person in her life. I had become a ghost, and it drove her crazy. I could see the desperation in her eyes. She'd try to do everything she could to bring back the man she thought I was. But she wasn't looking for me. She was looking for a version of me that no longer existed. One night, she tried to confront me. She came home, pacing around the living room, asking if we could talk, again. I can't do this anymore, Alexei, she said, voice trembling. I can't keep living like this. What do you want from me? But I didn't respond. I didn't look up from the book I was reading. I didn't care. It wasn't that I wanted to hurt her. I just didn't care about anything anymore. I had no more feelings for her. And that hurt more than any fight or accusation ever could. She stood there, waiting for an answer, for some kind of response. But I just kept reading. I let the silence drag on until she walked away, defeated. The next morning, she tried again. She made breakfast, placed the plate in front of me like everything was normal. She smiled at me, but it wasn't the same smile. It was tentative, unsure, like she was trying to gauge whether I'd bite. I didn't. I pushed the plate aside and walked out. She didn't follow. That was when I knew I had won. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about making her feel guilty. It was about stripping her of everything, her friends, her family, her confidence, and leaving her alone with nothing but her mistakes. And she was starting to realize that. Slowly. She was starting to feel it in the pit of her stomach, the weight of her choices. The silence between us was no longer a form of punishment. It was the final, irrevocable end to everything we had been. There was no going back. Not for her. Not for me. Elena didn't know how to exist in this new version of our life. The walls I'd built between us were so thick she couldn't see a way through them anymore. Every attempt she made to break the silence only pushed her deeper into it. Her desperate gestures, texts, calls, trying to make small talk over dinner, were just noise. I stopped listening, stopped caring. One night, she came into the living room where I was sitting, the same quiet desperation in her eyes. She wasn't even trying to pretend things were fine anymore. Alexei, she said, voice soft but shaky, I need to know what's going on with us. Please, can we talk? I can't do this. I didn't even look up from what I was doing. Do what? I asked, voice flat. It's clear what's happening here. Her eyes flicked between me and the floor. I don't know how to fix this. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. The words came out like a reflex for her, but they didn't land. I didn't need her apology. Not anymore. You don't have to keep apologizing, I said, my voice cutting through the space between us. It won't change anything. She winced, as if my words hit harder than she expected. She stepped back, but the damage was done. There was nothing left for her to fix. No words that could undo what had been broken. She hadn't seen it yet, but her efforts had already fallen apart. For the next few days, I watched her try to pull herself together. She'd attempt to smile, make casual conversation, even ask if I wanted to go out. But I was stone. I didn't respond to her texts, ignored her phone calls, and when she tried to talk, I offered nothing but silence. Then one night, she returned home late, her face a ghost of the woman she used to be. She stood in the doorway, holding her phone, as if that device could somehow fix everything. I tried calling Victor, she said quietly, almost too quietly. He blocked me. He won't talk to me. It was as if she were still holding on to the idea that there was some escape for her. She thought Victor would be her way out of all this, her way back to the happiness she'd given up. But the moment she'd chosen him over me, it had already been over. She didn't understand that. I didn't react. I just watched her, expressionless. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was just nothing. She collapsed onto the couch, her face buried in her hands, and the sound of her crying echoed through the room. But I didn't move. When she looked up at me, expecting something, anything, I didn't respond. I walked past her, as if she weren't even there. She tried to call after me, but I kept walking, out of the room, out of her reach. I wasn't angry. I was beyond that. The next day, she came home early, clutching the hope that something, some conversation, could fix everything. But I was already long gone in every way that mattered. She still didn't see it, that the thing she needed to fix had already slipped through her fingers. She had lost. And the truth was, she didn't need to understand why. It was too late. It had been too late for a while. I didn't need her to get it. I didn't need anything from her. I had already freed myself. And that peace, that was something she'd never have again. Weeks passed, and Elena had stopped trying to break through the wall I built between us. She could feel it now. The distance between us wasn't just emotional, it was permanent. She walked around the house, pretending things were fine, but I could see how she was slowly unraveling. One evening, after a long silent day, she finally asked the question I knew was coming. "Alexei," she said, standing in the doorway of the living room, her voice hesitant, "why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" I didn't look up from what I was doing. I'd been expecting this. I set the book down, meeting her eyes. "I don't want anything from you," I said, my tone flat. Her expression flickered with confusion. "What do you mean? Why can't we just talk about this? Why can't we fix it?" I didn't feel anger anymore, or sadness. It was just relief. "Elena, there's nothing to fix. You made your choice. Now I'm just living with it." She stepped closer, voice softening. "I never meant for it to go this far. I was confused. I made a mistake." I almost felt sorry for her, but the truth was, it wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And she couldn't seem to understand that. "You didn't make a mistake," I said, my voice cold. "You made a choice. And now it's over." Her face tightened, her eyes desperately searching mine, looking for some sign of the man she once knew. But there was nothing. She took a breath and asked, "Please, Alexei, don't leave me like this." Her words hit me like a distant echo. I wasn't angry with her anymore. I was just done. "I'm not leaving you, Elena," I replied, standing up. "I already did. You just haven't realized it yet." I walked past her without another word, and she didn't stop me. She didn't chase me down or beg. She just stood there, feeling the full weight of her actions. Over the next few days, Elena stopped trying to fix things. The constant fighting for my attention, the apologies, they all stopped. She couldn't pretend anymore. The gap between us was too wide now. She didn't even mention Victor again, and that was when I knew she understood. The affair had cost her everything. Me, our future, her friends, her family. And now she was left with nothing. I didn't care anymore. The silence between us wasn't punishment, it was freedom. The true punishment for her wasn't the distance or the loss, but the fact that I'd moved on long before she ever did. That realization was the one thing she'd never be able to escape. The days after our last conversation were the hardest for Elena. I could see her trying to keep it together, but the cracks were visible in everything she did. She no longer pretended to be fine, but instead, walked through the house like a ghost, quiet, distant, unsure of what to do next. She had already lost everything. She just hadn't fully realized it yet. It was hard for me to watch, but I didn't care. I had already let go. I wasn't angry or bitter anymore. I was numb. I had long since detached from the person who once was my wife. Now, she was nothing more than a reminder of what betrayal looked like. One morning, as I was getting ready to leave for work, I saw Elena standing in the doorway of the living room. She had the same defeated look in her eyes, but this time, there was something different. She wasn't begging, wasn't pleading. She was just waiting. "Alexei," she said quietly, her voice shaky but composed, "I know I've lost you. I know I can't change what happened. But, please, just tell me what to do now. I don't know where to go from here." For the first time in weeks, I looked at her, really looked at her. There was no anger in me, just a cold realization that she had crossed a point of no return. "You can't fix this, Elena," I said, my voice calm. "You can't fix what you broke. And you don't get to decide how this ends. You've already chosen your path." She nodded slowly, her face a mix of regret and acceptance. "I know," she whispered. "I know." I walked past her, the weight of everything finally settling in. She wasn't crying anymore. She didn't chase me or try to stop me. And for the first time, I felt like I had truly walked away from her. I knew she still had a long road ahead of her, but it wasn't mine to walk anymore. She had to face the consequences of her actions, and I had no intention of saving her from it. The person who loved her had been lost long ago. That evening, when I came back home, I saw that she had packed a bag. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was more like a quiet surrender. She was leaving, but there was no fanfare, no tearful goodbyes. She had no one to run to now. Not Victor, not her friends, not even her family. She stood by the door, looking at me one last time. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She knew. Her affair had already cost her everything. Her dignity, her future, and now, her place in my life. She left without another word. And I stood there, watching her go, but feeling nothing. It was done. The final step had been taken. Elena was gone. And I was free. The house felt too quiet after she left. I didn't feel relief at first. It wasn't peace. It wasn't freedom. It was emptiness. I walked through the rooms, knowing they were now empty in every sense of the word. There were no arguments left to have, no more apologies to hear, no more shattered pieces to pick up. It was just over. For the first time in months, I felt a strange stillness settle over me. At first, I thought I'd miss her, the way she used to laugh, the little things she'd do that made her my Elena. But the truth was, those things had been gone for a long time. The woman I had once known was already lost to me, buried under the weight of the lies and betrayal. I remember walking past our bedroom, the bed still made like nothing had changed. It looked so normal. It didn't match the chaos that had played out in our lives. But now it was just a room, another part of the house that used to belong to us, but now belonged to no one. I sat down in the living room, the place we used to spend hours talking, watching TV, just being. But now it was just a space. No warmth. No life. Just the echoes of a time that was never coming back. The phone never rang. The doorbell didn't ring. I didn't expect it to. Elena had gone, and with her went everything that used to make this place a home. I knew she wasn't coming back. She couldn't. She'd destroyed too much. And I had nothing left to give. I thought about the few times we tried to fix things, how she'd reached out, trying to bridge the gap between us. But it was always too little, too late. There was no going back from the moment I found out about Victor. And even before that, when the trust was broken, I knew it was only a matter of time. She had already left me before I walked away from her. It was late when I went to bed. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this exhausted, but it wasn't physical. It was mental, emotional. I had emptied myself out, shed everything that held me to her. The next morning, I woke up alone. The bed was empty, but it didn't feel empty. It felt right. There was no one to explain myself to, no one to apologize to, no one to care for but myself. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. Elena had left, and everything in the house was as it should have been. Quiet. Peaceful. And I was finally free. I didn't know what came next, but I didn't need to. The past was done. The future? That was mine to figure out. For the first time in a long time, I had nothing to hold me back. And that felt like the first real step toward living again. The first few days after Elena left were strange. It was like waking up from a long, restless sleep, disoriented, unsure of where to go, but knowing that somehow, I was still standing. For a while, the house felt like a foreign place, even though I'd lived there for years. It was no longer a home, not in the way it had been. It was just a space, a collection of rooms that no longer held memories I wanted to keep. I spent those days in a daze, cleaning out drawers, tossing things out. Old photos, random papers, useless trinkets. All reminders of a life I no longer wanted to remember. The more I threw away, the lighter I felt. It wasn't just about getting rid of her things, it was about shedding everything that tied me to that version of myself. The man who had loved her, who had trusted her. That person was gone now, and he wasn't coming back. I didn't feel anger, not anymore. I didn't feel sadness either. I just felt free. For the first time in a long time, I could breathe. I could make decisions without worrying about her opinion, about what we should do. It was all up to me now. One afternoon, I went for a walk in the park. The weather was turning colder, the leaves turning colors like the final act of a play, everything coming to an end. I walked aimlessly, the crisp air sharp against my skin. The park was mostly empty, just a few joggers and people walking their dogs. It was peaceful, and for the first time in a while, I realized I hadn't been thinking about Elena for a whole hour. It was like the weight of her betrayal was finally starting to lift from my chest. I sat down on a bench, staring at the trees, watching the wind rustle through them. I was alone, and that felt okay. I wasn't empty. I wasn't broken. I was just me, and that was enough. That night, I didn't go home immediately. I didn't want to be alone in the house just yet. So, I drove around, not really knowing where I was going, just letting the road take me. I ended up at a small bar on the edge of town, a place I'd never been before. It was quiet, low-lit, and had an old-school feel to it, like it had been around for decades and no one really noticed anymore. I sat at the bar, ordered a drink, and just listened to the quiet hum of the place. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. It was strange, but good. When I left, I walked out into the night air, feeling the cool breeze against my face. The world was still turning, still moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, I was, too. Elena had been a part of my life, but she no longer defined it. She had taken everything she could from me, but I had taken something back, too. My freedom. My peace. And whatever came next. Well, I was ready for it. The next chapter of my life was mine to write. And I wasn't looking back. It didn't take long for me to realize how much I had been holding back. 4 years, I'd been living in the shadow of a life that no longer fit. Now that Elena was gone, I didn't have to pretend anymore. I could finally be whoever I wanted to be, without worrying about anyone else's expectations. Not hers, not anyone's. I spent the next few weeks focusing on myself. I picked up old hobbies I'd abandoned, reading, playing music, going for long walks to clear my head. I didn't rush anything. The emptiness that once felt crushing was now just space. Space for me to figure out who I was, what I wanted, and what came next. One evening, I reconnected with Tom, an old friend I hadn't seen in years. When I told him what had happened, he didn't ask many questions. He could tell I wasn't ready to go into detail. Instead, we talked about everything but the past. Work, music, life in general. And for the first time in a long time, I realized how easy it was to just be me again. After that night, I started reaching out to people I'd lost touch with over the years. Friends, colleagues, even distant relatives. They all said the same thing. They could see the change in me. I was no longer weighed down by the past. I wasn't rushing into a new relationship or trying to fill the void left by Elena. It was more about rediscovering who I was without the constant strain of betrayal and lies. I wasn't defined by the mistakes we had made together anymore. I was free to build something new. The following months brought small victories. I got promoted at work, moved into a new apartment, and spent my weekends doing whatever I wanted without worrying about anyone else. It felt liberating to make decisions based solely on what I wanted. One weekend, I visited my family. It had been a while since I'd seen them, and I realized how much I'd withdrawn over the years. Spending time with them reminded me of who I was before everything went wrong. I was present, laughing, and enjoying life without holding back. As I left their house that evening, something inside me shifted. The person I had been, the one who was stuck in a marriage that wasn't working, the one who had been broken by lies, was gone. In his place was someone stronger, someone who understood that happiness doesn't come from fixing the past, but from embracing the future. I knew I wasn't fully healed yet, but I was okay with that. I wasn't looking for quick fixes or distractions. I was taking things one step at a time, learning to let go of the past and be open to what lay ahead. I was moving on, and that was enough. And for the first time in years, I could honestly say that I was free. Just when I thought I had everything figured out, life had a way of throwing me off balance. I was content in my new routine, work, weekends to myself, time spent with friends and family. I had started to rebuild, piece by piece. I wasn't rushing anything. I wasn't desperate. But I was starting to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It came unexpectedly. I met her at a coffee shop. It was nothing special, just a random stop on a Saturday morning to grab a drink before running errands. I was standing in line, lost in my own thoughts, when I noticed her standing next to me. She was a little older, more polished than I was used to, but there was something familiar about the way she smiled, something real, something genuine. We started talking about the weather, then about the book I was holding, then just about anything that came to mind. Her name was Anna. And I wasn't looking for this. I wasn't looking for anyone, really. But as we talked, something clicked. The conversation felt easy, uncomplicated. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was talking to someone who wasn't carrying baggage, someone who wasn't trying to heal from their past or make up for mistakes. She seemed comfortable in her own skin, and somehow, that made me feel more comfortable too. We exchanged numbers, not with any big plans or expectations, just a casual, let's grab coffee sometime. But I didn't expect anything to come of it. It wasn't about rushing into anything, it wasn't about fixing myself by finding someone new. It was just different. It was refreshing. Over the next few weeks, we met up a few times. Simple things, a walk in the park, a quick dinner after work, a couple of drinks at a local bar. And I realized something. I had forgotten what it felt like to connect with someone who wasn't tied to my past. She wasn't a substitute for Elena. She wasn't someone I was trying to force into a role. She was just herself, and for the first time, I was just me. No baggage, no expectations. There were no heavy conversations about what had happened in our pasts. We didn't need that. We were starting fresh, and that felt good. It felt like I was getting a second chance, not just at love, but at life. I wasn't ready to dive into anything serious, and neither was she. But it was nice to know that there were still connections to be made, still people out there who weren't weighed down by the past. For the first time, I wasn't looking back at what had been. I was looking forward. Maybe it was too soon. Maybe it wasn't. But I didn't care. I wasn't forcing anything. I was just living in the moment, embracing whatever came next. And for once, I felt like I had the freedom to choose. As the weeks passed, I found myself thinking about Anna more than I expected to. It wasn't anything intense or dramatic. We'd been keeping things light, taking things slow, and I was fine with that. But something about her presence in my life felt different. It was refreshing, like a breath of fresh air after years of feeling suffocated. I wasn't ready to dive headfirst into a relationship, but the idea of it, of being seen, heard, and appreciated, felt like something I hadn't experienced in a long time. We'd meet for coffee, or go on little walks. Our conversations were easy, comfortable, never forced. I'd never realized how much I'd missed this kind of simplicity, how much I'd been starved for connection without any strings attached. Anna wasn't looking for me to fix her or for me to be her savior. She was just herself, and that was enough. She was a reminder of the person I used to be before everything had turned dark, a version of me that I had almost forgotten. One evening, after a particularly good dinner at a small Italian place we both liked, Anna turned to me with a hesitant smile. "Alexei," she began, her voice soft, "I know we've been keeping things casual, and I'm fine with that. But I just wanted to ask, do you think you're really ready for this? For something more? I don't want to rush you into anything. I interrupted her, not out of impatience, but because I had been thinking the same thing for days. I hadn't realized how much I missed being real with someone until I found myself sitting across from her, having an honest conversation about what we both wanted, and where things could go. "I'm not rushing into anything," I said, meeting her eyes. "But I do think I'm ready for more. I'm not exactly sure what that looks like yet. But I know I don't want to go through life alone anymore. Not if I don't have to." She smiled, a soft, knowing smile that didn't try to rush me, didn't push me to move faster than I was ready for. "That's all I needed to hear," she said. "No pressure." And just like that, I felt a weight lift off my chest. I wasn't asking for anything more than what was in front of me. I wasn't looking for a perfect future. I wasn't even looking for closure. But I had found someone who could offer me something I didn't realize I had been missing. Genuine connection, without the baggage of the past. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was replacing Elena, or jumping into something out of fear or loneliness. Anna wasn't filling a gap. She was opening a door to something new. I wasn't sure where it would go, or what would come next, but for the first time, I felt okay with whatever happened. This wasn't a new chapter of my life. It was a whole new book. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't need to rush the story. I was content to let it unfold at its own pace. The freedom I had found wasn't just in letting go of Elena. It was in embracing the possibility of anything, the chance to start over not just in my own life but with someone else too. And for once, I wasn't looking back. Thanks for watching, subscribe to the channel and do not miss new videos. Good luck to all.